Jackal Among Snakes. Author, Nemorosus. Chapter 161, Step on Heads to Rise. Argrave naively estimated the journey back to Vasco would take 10 to 12 days. As it turns out, Argrave was not particularly good at estimating the length of fantasy backpacking trips. The journey took, altogether, 17 days. And that was only to make it to the mountain highway. It was not because of slow movement. Indeed, Argrave actually found himself enjoying things when they traversed across the black sand dunes. Annalise had described the burnt desert as having an austere beauty, before, and Argrave fully agreed with that assessment. Without scarred lungs and weak bones making things agonizing, the hike was pleasant. But that was when they were hiking. Though the first week had passed quickly, once they strayed far from Sethia, the air became unbearably dry once again. That dryness brought with it sandstorms. They were stalled by sandstorms twice. The first had lasted but one night, while the second lasted 3 whole days. They sought shelter within the mountains. Though offering plenty protection, they were too steep to traverse, halting all progress. Argrave had been worried the second sandstorm would never end, and they would starve. He'd already planned to eat Gilliman first. He was sure the elven vampire would agree. But the relentless barrage of black sand did end, eventually, and they finished out the journey. With a heave, Argrave pulled himself over a cliff onto stark grey plateau, pulling his legs up just after. The movement had been quick and smooth, and he felt some pride as he recalled the climb at the Druid's camp where Gilliman had needed to help him up. Every day felt like a gift now that his body had gone from a liability to a reliability. Annalise was already waiting with their 4 Brimasinas, her long braid of white hair whipping about as she turned and examined the architecture of the highway. Argrave turned round, where he received Darren's backpack. Soon after, the man climbed up, boots scraping against the stone wall. Argrave gestured towards Gilliman for his backpack, but the vampire simply climbed up as easily as one might climb out of a swimming pool. Between his plate armor and his heavy pack, such a thing was a ridiculous show of strength. "Show off," Argrave said to Gilliman, turning to the highway ahead. The abundance of grey metal made the highway seem nearly industrial. Metal sconces had once held magic lamps, but salvagers had come through here, stripping each and every sconce of their magic light. The closest ones reminded Argrave of exposed rebar. But the road kept winding up the mountain, dangerous cracks and cave-ins marring most of the road. Up high, one could see better maintained bits, where salvagers dared not tread. The stone road was steep and required climbing at the points where it had collapsed. Iron statues with bizarre faces were half buried in the rubble. Their faces resembled nutcrackers, though intricately wrought out of now rusty iron and morphed in exaggerated emotion. They were angry, full of rage, though rather than terrifying, the expressions seemed like mockery. "I cannot fathom how these highways were used," Annalise pondered. Transportation of troops between mountainside forts. Argrave stepped up beside her, putting his backpack back on. "Mountain climbing with heavy packs," Darren said, catching his breath as he leaned against his glaive. "I missed all the signs. I'm traveling with morons." Other options: abomination-ridden underground passage jam-packed with diseases, necromantic creatures of the Order of the Rose, and a knightly order who has vilified me. Argrave raised one finger. "Or we can ask the Lionsome Castle to open the gates for us. Barring these highways, there's no other way over these mountain peaks." "Underground passage. This is Nordrmaid, that city Garm spoke to me about." Darren caught his breath. Argrave nodded, surprised Darren knew more than he thought. Annalise walked up to a pile of rubble, touching one of the iron statues. "Don't be so carefree," Argrave called out. "Some of these statues are functioning golems." "These are the golems you mentioned?" Annalise asked, surprised. "The Vadaimon say golems are myths. And moreover, metal golems. The pathways and fortresses were made by men. The sconces, the golems. They were made by the subterranean mountain people I had intended to enlist against the vessels in Sethia." "You did not mention them in our plan for this place," Annalise noted. "They're gone, at least from here." Argrave shook his head. "Their creations remain." Darren looked quite skeptical. Argrave caught him frowning and took note of it but decided to wait for later. Argrave looked at the steep pathway ahead, feeling trepidatious. "You wanted to work on your body, right?" He gave himself a pep talk internally. "This is your chance. Come on, kill it." In truth, it was less mountain climbing and more rock scrabbling. The falls were not inherently deadly, simply painful. The most cumbersome part of the journey was their packs. During the hour, they advanced no more than a half-mile. It was strenuous, both mentally and physically, as they needed to plan out a path up the uneven road and then execute that plan. Darren voiced his skepticism frequently but kept pace with them despite hefting his glaive about. It was Annalise who struggled the most, though not to an excessive degree. Argrave felt strange when he was not the straggler. The Brimasinas conjured mist from their fur with a pleasant chiming song, then vanished into it, traversing their brim as they had in the tomb of the Southron elves. They would reappear at higher elevations, lounging and playing with each other as though this was a casual stroll rather than a treacherous climb. If Argrave didn't have such affection for the creatures, he might have gotten a headache from annoyance. Argrave locked his hands together, and Annalise stepped on him. He boosted her up, and then grabbed her backpack, placing it up beside her. After, he did the same for Darren and his glaive, and then he and Gilliman came up last. All save Gilliman were breathing heavy. They conjured water with spells, drinking heavily. I must ask for a break, Annalise gasped out. Argrave didn't answer, taking his time to catch his breath. After a time, he responded, take all the time you need and rest easy, because that was the last bit of climbing we'll need to do. He straightened his back. Now that we're up here, I'll stress this, follow me completely. No veering off course. Ahead, the highway's winding slopes flattened out, finally reaching level ground. The metal statues were much more abundant, and a few of the metal sconces still bore their enchanted glass orbs, even if they were dead by now. Argrave looked back beyond them. From up high, the burnt desert was even more beautiful. The distant and elaborate cities of the vessels seemed like stars in the sky or shining lights in the abyss. Long way down, Duran came to stand beside Argrave, leaning forth and placing his elbow on his knee. Going to be a shame when we have to turn around. No way this makes it all the way across. Argrave shook his head, only able to muster laughter at Duran's constant derision. After everyone recovered from their fatigue, they gathered their things and pressed onwards. Annalise kept her head upwards instead of watching the path ahead, examining the comically angry metal statues they walked by. Though still rusted, they were upright at this higher section, and most bore metal rods in hand. They took ridiculous poses, again intended to mock the warriors they portrayed. The top of those rods. Something was cut off there, severed. You can tell, she pointed. And what was once there? Argrave pressed amusedly, knowing the answer. I am unsure. They could be spears, long maces, jeweled scepters of some kind. Perhaps it would explain why they have been cut off. Argrave stayed silent as they trekked forward, a smile on his face. Why are you so amused? She frowned. You will keep me in the dark. Argrave held up a hand to shrug. You'll see what was there. That's all. Some guardian golems, if they just let whatever they held be cut off and stolen, Duran noted a bit sarcastically. Argrave glanced at Duran, then fished into his pocket. He scanned the nearby statues, then locked his eye on one in particular. He pulled free a silver coin minted in Maljuridum's style and flicked it towards a close golem. As the coin spun by the metal statue he'd had his eye on, its arm rocketed forth and the rod it held slammed into the ground. The coin had been caught perfectly, smushed around the edge of the rod. Its arm clicked like a wind-up toy, cranking back to its original position. The silver coin hung at the edge of the rod, morphed around it. These ones are stationary. They attack anything that enters into their line of attack. Argrave smiled. It gives them greater power. Duran stared at the coin, and then glanced at the silver smudge left behind where it had been beaten around the rod. Nearly poked one of those things to test it, he said a little hauntedly. Argrave gave Duran a pat on the shoulder, then kept walking. The path was rough and poorly maintained, and grass growing up through the stone had left great cracks in everything. Harsh winds were shielded by higher peaks around them. The path tunneled into a mountain. In that tunnel, the path narrowed, and 1,000 statues lined up shoulder to shoulder. Duran tapped his glaive against the ground. Not sure anyone alive can maneuver through that, if those things are all like those metal meat crushers we passed by. Argrave veered from the center of the road, walking towards one of the statues. I would never, he scolded, retrieving another coin. He tossed it, and its right arm whirred, slamming the rod in hand against the ground. The rod was thicker than most of the others. Argrave stepped atop the rod, balancing carefully as it clicked and rose back up. Once it was at its highest point, he stepped off onto the statue's shoulder, then stood on its head. Guilliman, you're last, Argrave shouted down. Rescue anyone in case they fall. Guilliman nodded. Duran seemed thrilled at what Argrave had done, practically beaming in anticipation. He kicked a rock towards the golem, then leapt atop the thick rod once it slammed against the ground. He rode it upwards to the top, and they stayed standing there. Annalise, you go. I'll jump off just before it swings, he suggested eagerly. Argrave grabbed his glaive and pulled Duran off the rod, stepping aside to make room atop the statue's head. Duran nearly lost his balance, but managed to correct himself before it was too late. He looked aggrieved, but Argrave could not be bothered. Annalise ascended up next, legs a bit shaky. Argrave moved to the next statue in the long row to accommodate her. Just after, Guilliman came, reaching the top just as they had without incident. Now that they all stood atop the statues, Argrave led. He jumped from statue to statue, stepping on their heads like one might move from rock to rock on a river. They entered into the tunnel, where Argrave's head very nearly touched the ceiling with every jump. Everyone was deathly quiet, realizing all too well the consequences of falling. After a while, Argrave came to a statue that had a missing head and kneeled where its head once was. Gods, Duran exclaimed, coming to a stop. Got into a rhythm, almost jumped at you. What are you doing? Argrave scanned the statues in the adjacent row. His eyes settled on one that held its rod with two hands. He turned his head to Duran. You're probably better aim than me. Trigger that one, there, Argrave pointed to it, handing the tribal a coin. And brace yourself. Ground might shake a little. Duran held the coin tightly. Just throwing away money, he muttered, taking a second. After aiming, he flicked his wrist out, tossing the coin. It rung through the air. The statue triggered, thrusting straight upwards. Its metal stick slammed loudly against the ceiling. A few rocks fell. And then after, the tunnel's ceiling caved in, including much of the wall close to it. Argrave stayed kneeling, covering his mouth from dust. They all stayed still and tense as the dust settled. Once it had, Darren lowered his hand. "What was it for? Fun?" "It's a secret wall," Argrave responded, rising to his feet. The statue just across from them bent its waist, bowing, and held its hands out as though begging. Though crude, it formed a walkway across. Argrave stepped across without hesitation, heading for the great hole in the wall caused by the cave-in. In the hole created, stairs poked out from the rubble. It was a deliberate design, not a flawed installation of their golem. The subterranean people were masters of tunneling and boring, and enjoyed putting tricks like this in their tunnels. Argrave had been a bit worried this would work, but it did so flawlessly. Chapter 162, Spiteful Sparrows. The verdant, sheltered grove atop the mountains between the burnt desert and Vasco was not an especially large place, but it was teeming with creatures thought long dead or shrouded in myth. It was like a little microcosm atop the mountains. Though the winds were harsh and the air cold outside, a pleasant, temperate atmosphere persisted here. In Heroes of Berenda, this place was a hotspot for players seeking out rarer herbs for potent alchemical potions. Its only superior was Princess Eleanor's greenhouse, but getting there involved a fairly long quest line. Argrave was hit with a wave of nostalgia as they stepped towards the pavilion of jade stone. He had come here so many times, and now he was back again, physically present. The brightly colored, beautiful flowers, belying their poisonous nature. The animals' cries, some of which he recognized, and flashes of gold, flying through the air and disappearing so quickly they appeared to be an illusion. They were far too fast to track with the eyes. At a point, one of the flashes ceased just above the jade pavilion. It was a small bird no larger than a tennis ball seemingly crafted of gold, wings fluttering so fast as to be nigh invisible. The moment it moved again, it vanished like an illusion. "I saw it," Annalise said excitedly, pointing a finger at where it once was. Once she processed it had already vanished. She amended, "It was just I swear it." "Sounds like crazy talk to me." Argrave acted ignorant, but he couldn't fool Annalise, who gave a small huff of amused annoyance and kept looking around. "Fastest thing I've seen." Glimmer adjusted his helmet. "Can't track it." Darren placed his glaive upon a rock and hefted himself up a bit. "A star sparrow, closer akin to a hummingbird." "No." Argrave made it to the pavilion and put his hand on one of the jade pillars holding the roof up. "Just what they called it," he said idly. "Who's they?" Darren followed up. "The subterranean mountain tribes that conquered this place," Argrave answered at once, only to frown upon further introspection. In the past, his first thought would have been the game's developers. His way of thinking was changing. It was paradoxically comforting and unsettling. He was integrating with his new life. Shaking it off, Argrave continued, "Most people that leave behind a treasure, we're talking gemstones, gold. For the people that lived underground, they preserved the beauty of the surface, and the tools they used to conquer. In this case, the golems." Argrave stepped away from the pavilion, eyes wandering. "And these sanctuaries? Those are the things they hold precious." Everyone drank in the rich atmosphere of the place. Argrave could swear that even the air tasted better. Steam rose from the pools which the waterfalls fed, marking them as heated springs. It was an intoxicatingly peaceful place. "You have any notion on how you plan to catch light?" Darren was the first to bring them back. "These birds. Unless we've got steel-wired nets and hands quicker than lightning, I can't imagine we'll have much luck." Argrave took a deep breath and nodded, steeling himself to keep going. "It could be quite simple, provided we get lucky. Otherwise, we'll be shepherding a bird into a trap for some hours." Argrave pointed to the waterfall. "There's a small cave behind that thing that shelters some pools. Some birds might be drinking from it, or there might be a nest in there." "That's what we're hoping for." Darren frowned but gave an acquiescent nod. "Considering we had to cave in the place to get here, I imagine you haven't been here before. Yet you know all of this." "All things with time," Argrave assured Darren, patting his shoulder. The golden-eyed tribal followed him as he walked away, lost in thought. Eventually, he shook his head and proceeded. As it turns out, they were not lucky. The cave behind the waterfall was small, possessing only one entrance and amounting to no more than 1,000 square feet at best. Annalise conjured a ward at the entrance to prevent escape and investigated but could not find any star sparrows within. As a consequence, they began the laborious process of trying to force the bird to go into that place. Annalise remained by the cave, standing by to put the lid on the jar, so to speak. The three others were relegated to bird-herding duty. Guilliman was adept at spotting the star sparrows, and so Argrave followed his lead. The vicious plants of the sanctuary proved to be cumbersome, and Argrave was forced to watch the path they took for dangerous things. Some of them had acidic liquid on their leaves that could eat through steel. Others were genuinely carnivorous. Though Argrave had a solid grasp of herbology even now, he was not perfect. Guilliman's fast reaction times was the only reason he was never genuinely hurt while leading them. The first tower was utterly fruitless. Even ignoring the dangerous flora, some of the fauna proved to be quite aggressive. Everything in here was beautiful, true enough, but everything was equally deadly. Simple butterflies spewed poisonous mists when threatened. The second tower proved a little better. They chased a star sparrow for a time, but it was hardly herding. It was more along the lines of annoying it until it moved a little. Argrave fell into a poisonous bush chasing after it. He had panicked a great deal at first, before recalling he was black-blooded and poison meant little to him. Forget being poisoned. He didn't even get a rash. The third and fourth, or was it 5 hours, their disorganized pursuit began to resemble a coordinated effort. Argrave took the role of commander, directing Gilliman and Duran to go to certain locations to receive the oncoming bird. Meanwhile, he directed his Brumasiners to conjure warriors of mist at key locations, further limiting its escape options. He was glad it wouldn't simply leave the sanctuary and go somewhere else. Finally, just as the suns neared the point of setting, the bird finally headed towards the cave and zigzagged about, evoking nervousness from all of them. As if told to do so, the bird quickly darted down and disappeared into the cave. Annalise conjured her ward and entered through it. Argrave and Duran cheered loudly, and even Gilliman seemed quite pleased. They celebrated with each other as Annalise proceeded into the cave. Argrave tried to pick up Duran, but he hadn't improved to the point of being able to do that, and only succeeded in embarrassing himself. When Annalise emerged without a golden bird in hand, their pleased expressions froze. The bird had escaped before she conjured the ward. None, not even Gilliman, had seen it. Spirit broken, Argrave called a break to watch the sun set with Annalise. He would never break this tradition of theirs if he could help it. After, dejected beyond compare, they once again sought out the devilish star sparrow. The suns fell behind the mountains, but they pressed on. They needed to capture that bird to regain their honor. When the moon reached its midpoint, they once again succeeded in herding a star sparrow towards the cave. Duran must have got a prophecy from heaven, because he aimed magic just above the cave's overhang, striking it with lightning. The bird was frightened and sought the cave for cover, and Annalise once again conjured her ward. With bated breath, all watched her enter and search out the cave. They crouched a good distance away, battered and hopeful. Argrave's heart was beating fast when he saw a flash of white hair emerge out from the cave. She let down the ward, and a little golden flash darted out from the cave, taking its place on her shoulder. Even Gilliman joined them in a primal roar of triumph at that moment. Gods, I think I twisted something, Duran complained, stroking his ankle. Should have learned healing magic, Argrave reprimanded, then used a C-rank spell of his own near the man's ankle. It was the morning of the next day. Despite the strenuous yesterday, Argrave still felt ready to go. Duran and Gilliman did more physical work than he did as they lacked the support of the Brumasiners. Even still, the effects of becoming black-blooded were obvious every day. All it took was a night's rest, and though he was a bit sore, he was ready to go. Annalise sat in the jade pavilion, seemingly meditating. Argrave and Duran sat on the stairs leading up to the pavilion, guarding her. She was using druidic magic to control the bird directly. Meanwhile, Argrave sat with another little creature in his lap. Annalise had surrendered her Brumasinger to him, unable to maintain more than one direct bond. With this, he now had 4 of the little foxes. Phew. Annalise let out a sigh as she fell back, supporting herself with her hand. A flash of gold entered Argrave's peripheries, and then a golden bird settled on her shoulder. The star sparrow was a cute thing, a sparrow of solid gold, yet Argrave could not look at the little monstrosity kindly. It flies so quickly. It feels like my heart will stop every time I move possessing it. If I wish to be somewhere within sight, I can reach it within seconds. And it can see for miles, she described wondrously, eyes still closed. The description brought some curiosity from Argrave. In Heroes of Berenda, bonding with the star sparrow just maximize the player's perception, enabling them to see everything on the minimap far in advance. For attacking, it did decent damage, and could dodge nearly everything. But one hit would kill it, and so most players kept it protected. Argrave was somewhat envious, but he supposed grass was always greener on the other side. Annalise could only bond with one animal at a time, but it enabled her complete control over that animal. Conversely, Argrave's pack leader allowed him control over multiple animals, though with a lesser degree of control. It was further limited to creatures of the same species. It should be able to see ants on trees atop other peaks. What with all the trouble we had, Duran muttered. Argrave's Brumasinners strode towards Annalise, showing affection towards her. His druidic bonds always mirrored what he felt. Argrave was coming to find. The golden star sparrow jumped atop one of them, and they played in harmony. Well, Argrave grunted as he rose to his feet. My Brumasinners are getting peckish, and they can't eat here. There are no lingering souls. He looked around the secluded grove. We got what we needed. Now, we need to harvest some food for the star sparrow and get out. It's a picky eater, needs to eat the seeds of magic plants. We need to get what we can while we can. Fortunately, there's plenty here. Argrave stepped off the jade pavilion, already moving to do as he'd described. Duran looked at him, clearly exhausted, and sighed. He shook his head, dispelling tiredness, and then gave himself a slap to wake himself up. Hunted for hours, now we get its food. The tribal muttered. With the matter of the star sparrow settled in a relatively timely manner, they departed from the mountain sanctuary and back onto the road of Gillams. Though the beginning was rough for Duran and Annalise, who were weary, soon enough they caught their stride, and the remainder of the journey through the tunnel was uneventful. They exited from the narrow tunnels abounding with stationary Gillam traps back into the fast-moving mountain winds. The path continued onwards for a time, still surrounded by rusted statues, before opening up into a large central square. This square branched off into several paths. Most importantly, one could see over the mountains, beyond into Vasca territory. There was no clear path down, but that it could be seen was evidence enough. Their journey across the burnt desert was very nearly well and done. Darren rushed across the square, gazing out across the land with wonder. There it is. The lands beyond the northern mountains. Argrave stepped up beside him. It couldn't exactly be called a land of endless green. They were in the heart of winter, and the fields had changed accordingly. Look, you can see some snow further north, he pointed. I told you about it earlier. I know what snow is, you damned imbecile, he laughed. You think I've never flown to a mountain's peak with a wyvern? Argrave tried his best not to laugh. Elsewhere, Annalise called out, they were spears. As though enlightened, Argrave turned his head, following her line of sight. Indeed, at the edge of the square, one of the glams still had its spear intact. The spearhead was strange, it resembled a knife. Indeed they are, Argrave nodded, stepping up to her. The subterranean people, they had a mythical figure they revered. He was a master thief. Allegedly, he fought a great commander from Vasca, and during their battle, he cut off the man's spearhead. After, he used that weapon as a knife, and led his people to conquer the mountains. Then, these statues. The reason they are missing their spearhead. They mimic the warrior that thief overcame? They stand as a symbol of pride? Sort of. Argrave nodded. He retrieved the last of the coins minted in the burnt desert. They'd have no value in Vasca, so he was disposing of them one by one. Gilliman, hit the one we're looking at, he called out, handing the vampire the coin. Gilliman took the coin, gaze jumping between Argrave, it, and the statue. Eventually, he flourished the coin between his fingers, then flicked it towards the statue. Instead of being struck down, the flying coin struck the statue squarely on the face. Steam blew out of its nose, further exaggerating the angry expression on its face. And then, it stepped forward. They're a test, a trial. Each and every one. Argrave watched as it approached, each step jerky. The ground shook as it walked. Everyone seemed panicked, but Argrave held his hand out, casting a druidic spell. His brimacines emerged from his clothing, scattering across the ground. Mist spread out from their fur, consuming the square. With another spell, Argrave focused his will on the spearhead. As the brim consumed the square, their warriors conjured by the small foxes appeared, battering at it relentlessly. They took the form of the Southron elven warriors slain in the battle against Priam. They hacked just beneath the spearhead, and eventually they succeeded in cutting through the metal. The spearhead clattered to the ground. The titanic Gillam halted, grinding and clicking to a stop. Argrave walked over to the fallen spearhead and picked it up. It was a nice knife, even despite enduring the elements all these years. Even still, it couldn't be compared to the two that Argrave came here to get. Fortunately, there's a reason I went so far out of my way to get my little friends, Argrave concluded, holding the knife up. Chapter 163, The Skyburnt Fortress. Argrave tossed aside the newly acquired knife. It clattered against the floor. Some of the knives could be good loot, but he had nothing to evaluate them with. Give warning before you do something like that, Annalise rebuked Argrave, placing her hand to her heart and sighing to dispel her tension. Gilliman put away his sword. Argrave shrugged without a response, watching Dran walk past the Gillam while giving it a wide berth. He bent over, leaning on his glaive, and retrieved the discarded knife. Good gods, if I'd known your little fellas could muster warriors that could cut steel, I might have thrown them a snack or two, won their favor. Darren flipped the spearhead knife through his fingers, running his fingers opposite the edge to test its sharpness. They eat souls. Argrave turned to him. Might be you have fed them, but not deliberately. Darren gazed at the four small creatures scamper back to Argrave, seeking refuge in his clothes once again now that their task was done. Got a miracle pet lined up for me? Argrave blanked. It was a good point, certainly, but he'd been too distracted to plan for what to assign to Darren. He mulled for a moment, then recalled, you'll have to get to C rank if you want any permanence in bonds. Most of the D rank druidic spells aren't the type that'll keep your druidic links lingering by your side for longer than a few hours. Annalise has the C rank bond, while I use pack leader, and in time, I plan on learning the B rank spell, progenitor, to bind us in a druidic network. Annalise butted in. That spell Teros used back at the druidic camp in Mateth? Argrave pointed, but then realized she probably wouldn't know as she hadn't been there. Never mind, I know what it is. That will be useful. Argrave nodded. At that point, you'll be able to notice what my brimacines notice. Between the star Sparrow and them, ambushing us is going to be impossible. And that's a damn great thing, because we can win most fights we're aware are coming. C rank spells, huh? Darren clenched his fist. Alright, got something to focus on. Might be I come to you two for pointers. Argrave walked to Annalise and placed his hand on her shoulder. Sure. Annalise is the best teacher you could ask for. He took his hand off, glancing around the square. But we've idled enough. It's time to head to Isenza, the Skyburnt Fortress. With those words, his gaze rested on the only road remaining that headed upwards. It went along the top of the peak, heading steadily upwards. A giant drum tower was visible in the far distance, like a capstone atop the mountains. Unlike the roads before, this was one adorned with mostly fully functioning golems, their spears still intact. Few of the subterranean people cared to test themselves on golems of that sort. And barring two, Argrave didn't plan on it, either. Goleman raised his hands to his ears, startled by the deafeningly loud thunder booming out across the peaks. Everyone else was a step slower in reacting, but they all turned to the sky where stormy clouds whirled far above. Lightning on mountain tops. Forget this, Durrant shouted out. We should call it a day, wait for conditions to improve. I like living. They won't improve, said Argrave loudly. This place is always misery weather-wise. The Skyburnt fortress, Dissonance, was the only piece of architecture atop these peaks built wholly by the subterranean mountain people. It was octagonal in shape, built around a cone mountain peak. 8 towers marked 8 corners, each with a jade pavilion atop them similar to the one they'd seen within the wildlife sanctuary. The cone peak had a great drum tower built atop it, and the peak's innards had been bored out to make stairs leading up to the tower. As they continued to watch the stormy skies, lightning struck again. The lightning arched towards the top of the jade pavilions, where spikes of metal rose up into the sky. The metal spike and jade pavilion both sparked, glowing brilliantly even amidst the shade of the clouds. Despite the size of the apparent storm, no rain fell. Even the winds had ceased. You really want to go in there? Durrant asked incredulously. Even the youngest in the tribes know not to fly a wyvern in a storm. This is no good. This place isn't natural. We'll be fine. Just don't step on the jade, Argrave warned, stepping forward. If you don't step on the jade, you'll be fine. If you do step on it, you might die. Argrave took the first step forward, and his 2 elven companions followed without second-guessing him. Durrant hung back, turning in the road as though deliberating between waiting outside and following. Eventually, he let out a low laugh, and rushed to catch up with Argrave. They passed beneath the great gateways of Dissonance, where 2 golems 3 times the size as those on the road stood guard. Their spearheads were fashioned of great swords. Frankly, those 2 gate golems were nightmarish when compared to the weapon they dropped, and Argrave was quite glad that he didn't need to fight them. The interior of Dissonance was a barren place, but it seemed busy. That was lending to the pattern running across the floor. The place was a maze of simple, grey stone and beautifully polished jade. Whenever the clap of thunder deafened them, the jade on the floor would spark and glow, gleaming dangerously. The ice of Balin. Goleman muttered. What? Argrave turned back. Goleman said nothing, watching the jade writhe with sparks at random intervals. Then, he knelt down, staring a bit closer. The ice of Balin is said to conduct electricity in this manner. I thought it only myth, but the appearance, its characteristics. Argrave raised a brow, thinking on the matter. If he prowled his memory, the term was vaguely familiar. You'll have to tell me more of it later, Argrave concluded, and Annalise nodded in agreement. Goleman grunted, rising to his feet. Give me some space. Argrave held a hand out. I'll lead. I know the way. We have to walk across this. If we're closely bunched, someone might bump into someone, cause an unfortunate accident. Whether it be the walls, the floor, the ceiling, be very mindful of what you touch. Avoid this ice of Balin. Follow my lead. Despite Argrave's confident command, he took a deep breath to fight his uncertainty. Everyone gave him ample space, watching him closely. He set his foot down on the first bit of stone, very mindful of how near he was to the jade. Like this, Argrave stepped forward ever so slowly. He took a safe, if streamlined, route, heading around the central drum tower in the center towards where he knew the stairs would be. He was ever mindful of how large his feet were in this moment, and more than a bit resentful of this fact. He remained cautious with his steps and deliberated long before he touched anything for balance. Whenever the lightning sparked, it was difficult to avoid being distracted by the brightness and the sound of it. Between focusing on the path and avoiding being distracted by the myriad distractions, it was very fitting to call this place a test. He could not afford any focus to the people behind him. Eventually, he looked up and saw an opening in the drum tower. He let out a light sigh of relief. Like this, he took measured steps towards it, refusing to allow his caution to drop even slightly. With his enchantments, he wasn't sure if the lightning would kill him outright. It definitely didn't stand to be pleasant, though, and Argrave made sure not to test that theory. When Argrave passed the opening, things became easier. A stairway lay ahead. These stairs simply alternated. In every 2 steps one was made of jade, the other of stone. Considering Argrave took stairs 2 steps at a time normally, it didn't prove to offer much challenge at all. Argrave got into a stable position, and then waited for his companions to get closer. Anyone had any shocking revelations? Argrave called out once everyone had caught up. Ampli.10vlisp.c0m. Listen, leaderman, now is not the time, Durrant called out with a tight voice. Argrave was too tense to laugh at that, and he turned to the stairs once he was content everyone was well. Despite the ease it offered, he moved very cautiously. The stairs were smaller than his feet, as it turned out, and so he needed to awkwardly maneuver with his feet held sideways to avoid touching the jade portions. That, coupled with the fact that he couldn't use the walls for balance easily, made it much more difficult than he had thought. After probably the most tiring set of stairs Argrave had ever endured, he saw the storm hovering above. He didn't dare drop his caution at that point, very carefully making his way up to the top of the central drum tower. The top of the drum tower was flat, marked by a large jade spiral starting from the center and moving outwards. Each branch of the spiral was thin, and easy to step over. The parapets were tall enough that even Argrave could not see over the higher portions. At the opposite end of where they had come from, two golems stood. They were a fair bit larger than most of the ones that had decorated the walkway. They were more complete, somehow, their figures were more intricate, and they bore genuine armor. It seemed to be plate mail. Their spears, too, were different, most notably in the spearhead. The knife spearheads were blue, green crystals on their length shining brightly. Darren emerged, carefully jumping past the last jade stairway onto the bit of stone that was safe. He held his arms out and smiled in triumph, eyes darting around. He spotted the golems, and his face fell. Gods be damned. You bloody bastard. He looked at Argrave incredulously. Yep, Argrave nodded. Darren pointed his glaive. These are the ones we're to fight, and on this hellscape that sparks every couple seconds? Argrave shook his head. No, I came up here to get a nice view for our picnic. Alright. Stupid question, Darren conceded. Well, I guess I get to sit back while you get your little creatures to slave away. Au contraire, Argrave waved his finger. The knives these guys have are a little too strong to be chopped very quickly, and they're a little faster than their jerky relatives. Argrave took a deep breath. The master thief I mentioned, in their folklore, he was attuned with lightning. Allegedly, those spears hold the daggers he used. Argrave held his arms out. Stands to reason that the test to get them won't be easy, no? His gaze passed between Gilliman and Darren. Gilliman caught on quickly, and after a while, Darren's face grew somber as he realized what was to be asked of him. We ought to plan. Argrave clasped his hands together. Lucky for all of us, I know how these guys fight. As much as Argrave wished he could simply fight these golems from a safe place, no such safe place existed. Against these foes, maneuverability was a valuable thing. The area was wide, and though it had one prevailing hazard, the spirals were thin and easily sidestepped as long as one remained cautious. Gilliman stood at the forefront. Darren was near him, if slightly behind. Annalise and Argrave stood at the back. Argrave had his Promotioners prepared for combat, while Annalise has moved her Star Sparrow a safe distance away. It couldn't be called a formation. There weren't enough people, but it was definitely deliberate, and all prepared for the fight with the two golems across. The first to make their move, as agreed, was Gilliman. He got his bow and arrow ready, taking aim. Without hesitating much, it twanged out, the loosed projectile soaring through the air ordinarily. It struck the golem on their right. At once, the whole air seemed to shift. The still black clouds above them writhed, and all electric activity within ceased. As if reaching down, the center of the cloud descended downwards a single point, heading for the golems. The storm clouds seemed to enter into their nose, their ears, their eyes. Darren clenched his glaive a bit tighter. After a time, the electricity within the clouds sparked loudly, then rained upon the right side golem's spear in such large quantity as to produce a boom louder than any that had come before. Everyone flinched from the intensity of the sound even though they had all expected it. Both of the golems stepped forward, black storm clouds billowing from their joints and their eyes. Their eyes sparked with electricity, visible even through the black mist surging from within. Their exaggeratedly angry expressions seemed genuinely terrifying in that moment. Darren laughed maniacally. Gods above, my heart's skipping beats. The golem on the right side hefted its spear. It seemed to be holding a solid mass of electricity. I've got to concur, Argrave shouted back. The golem slammed the spear down, and electricity consumed the spirals, sending pillars of lightning up into the sky in the shape of a vortex. When things settled, the lightning had passed to the golem on the left side. Chapter 164, Giantkillers. Gilliman had taught Argrave a lot about combat, commanding, and strategy. The man was a great general, and Argrave was eager to learn whatever he could from him. Barring his own personal interest on the matter, as things proceeded, he would be talking to and commanding a lot more than a group of 4 and their pets. He needed to learn these things. He told Argrave of a simple principle: when fighting multiple foes, focus on ending one foe quickly so as to upset the balance in one's favor. That strategy held up with his knowledge of video games in general. When fighting multiple bosses, or even just regular enemies, it's best to focus on one and knock it out quickly. After deliberating on the matter, Argrave recalled a phrase that was used to describe that, even if indirectly, divide and conquer. It wasn't a one-to-one match in terms of definition, but the point stood: enemies united are much more difficult to deal with. Gilliman, Argrave shouted as the golems approached them. He triggered the blessing of supersession for caution's sake, though he was not sure he would need it. He could not bombard these foes with electric eels. The golem on the left side bore lightning on its spear. Its actions were smooth, fluid, and it proceeded towards them in an almost human run. In stark contrast, the golem on the right side without lightning was more withdrawn, and it did not move half as fast as its companion. Soon enough, it trailed behind its lightning-clad ally. Gilliman received Argrave's command and rushed forward to meet the lightning-wreathed golem. Though the elven vampire was huge, The golem was titanic. Argrave estimated it was near 12 feet tall, and with the black storm clouds billowing from its body, it appeared larger. Nevertheless, Guilliman approached it without fear. Argrave cast a subset spell of Pack Leader, commanding his Bromisoners to attack what he willed. Simultaneously, he shouted, "Duran, I know." The tribal returned as he moved along the edge of the circular tower, heading towards the rightward Guilliman. Guilliman met with a lightning-wreathed golem, his greatsword at the ready. He kept a safe distance away, not moving to attack at all. The golem raised its spear in one hand, then thrust. The attack was inhumanly fast, yet Guilliman returned with an equally ridiculously fast sidestep. The spear impaled the ground, sending a single surge through the jade spiral. None were on the jade, though. It dragged its spear through the stone, sending rubble and sparks flying everywhere, and did a great underhand swing at Guilliman, who again dodged narrowly. On the opposite side, Duran engaged with the other golem. Though slower, it was still ridiculously potent. Because of its slowness, though, Duran led it away, battering its spearhead with relentless casts of the D-rank spell, Windblade. It rarely had an opportunity to swing. Argrave and Annalise followed this fight. Argrave's 4 Bromisoners relentlessly battered its spearhead with conjured warriors, the foxes howling their song while writhed in the broom. Annalise contributed where she could, but without getting dangerously close it was difficult to be accurate. Argrave's gaze constantly wandered to the golem battling Guilliman. It was a ridiculous show of prowess from both sides. The golem had a machine ruthlessness, destroying parts of the tower parapet with ferocious swings as Guilliman dodged with finesse entirely unbefitting the plate armor he wore. The armor served its purpose, though, shielding him from stones whistling through the air after each staggeringly powerful attack. Argrave wasn't watching because of worry. He was waiting for a sign. The moment he saw the lightning-clad Guilliman put 2 hands on its spear, he shouted as loud as he could, "Switch!" Duran pushed the back of his glaive against the tower's parapet, narrowly dodging a swing from the golem. He slid beneath its legs and then took her off in a desperate sprint towards the opposite side. The golem fighting Guilliman raised its spear up and slammed the ground. Just as they had before, pillars of electricity roared up into the sky from the spiral of jade on the floor loud enough to make Argrave's ears hurt. When things settled, the golem that had been combating Duran now bore lightning, and Guilliman disengaged to go meet it. He and Duran passed by each other, and Duran took the attention of the other golem now bereft of lightning. Argrave didn't know if Duran had fled too well, or if Guilliman had disengaged too slowly. Regardless, the 12-foot-tall monstrosity of angry metal turned towards Argrave and Annalise. Its first ground-shaking step made it clear that they didn't have enough time to get away. They both stepped backwards, terrified. His mind worked quickly. Annalise is to my right, Guilliman is to my left. He's the only one that can deal with this golem effectively. She's furthest from Guilliman. With rationality and emotions both cementing his decision, Argrave ceased retreating. He stepped forward and pushed Annalise further back in one motion. He tried to head towards Guilliman, kiting the golem, but the thing was so fast it mattered little. Its first attack towards Argrave was a wide right-hand swing. It was deceptively fast, and the lightning distorted his view, but Argrave crouched and lurched backwards. He could feel heat move near his face as the spearhead passed by. In seconds, the towering thing grew closer. It pulled its hand back, preparing a thrust. Argrave used his enchanted ring to conjure a B-rank ward. The golem thrusted with the speed of a snake's bite, and the attack met the golden ward. The shield didn't last more than a second before shattering. Fortunately, Argrave didn't need more than a second. He dodged, and the attack sunk deep into the stone just beside his foot. He saw Guilliman very close, and felt some triumph extinguish his panic. Argrave tried to move, but it felt like he was kicking air. His eyes darted to the ground to see the stone bricks beneath him crumbling. It must have hit a weak part of the floor, Argrave realized. He started to see the half-jade, half-stone stairs below. As the floor beneath him fell away, Argrave sought out something, anything, to find purchase, but the entire floor was collapsing. Guilliman was close, but too far to beat gravity. There was something solid, though. Argrave grabbed the gollem's arm, glaring up at its eyes billowing smoke, sparking with electricity. He felt it move, pulling him back. Argrave yanked himself forward, away from the crumbling floor and the spearhead, and then Argrave saw white and felt tremendous pain. For a few seconds, he didn't know where he was. Slowly, whiteness faded, and his sight returned. He realized he was on his back, staring up at the sky. He couldn't breathe at all. He grabbed at his chest. It felt like someone had dropped a 300-pound barbell right on his ribs. He'd probably been struck by the shaft of the gollem's spear. If not for his enchanted gear, he was certain he'd be dead. As though brought back to life, Argrave sat up, taking in small, pained breaths as his windedness faded. He tried to stand but failed. He was spasming slightly, likely the electricity from the gollem's blow. When his vision fully returned, he saw the lightning-wreathed golem striding towards him, spear held at the ready. That was motivation enough to stand, pain though he was. A black axe struck the approaching golem in the head. While barely reacting to the blow itself, it did turn from Argrave. Guilliman had thrown his axe and stood holding his great sword in one hand. Argrave watched the axe fall over the edge of the tower, lost. Annalise rushed over at that point, practically tackling Argrave away. She helped him to safety, and once she was content he was there, moved to rejoin the fight. She said something, but Argrave couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. He took a few seconds to gather himself, regain his bearings, and then stood straight once again. This time, Argrave focused on the golem and engaged, aiming for it because they had already damaged the spearhead heavily. Darren held off the other admirably, luring it far away on his own. With the speed of the lightning-clad golem attacks it was difficult to land blows, yet Argrave's Brumusners still chipped away at it. The golem put two hands on its spear, and Argrave at once shouted, "Switch!" Again. The shout must have dislodged something, because he felt a little blood in his mouth. As the golem prepared to slam its spear on the ground, Annalise launched herself in the air slightly with a spell of wind. She held her hand out and used the C-rank ice spear. The spear of ice met the descending slam in transit. A crack echoed through the air, and though the lightning slammed into the ground, something metal soared through the air, clattering against the ground. The golem halted, and all the storm cloud within it dispersed, surging towards the other golem. Argrave spotted the severed spearhead, and feeling some triumph, faced the other foe. Though clad in lightning and monstrously fast, only one remained. Darren fled from the now empowered golem. His flight was not as fast as the first time, though, and the golem gained on him. It swung just as he neared the now immobile other golem, and he sought refuge behind it. The lightning-wreathed spear slammed into the other golem's chest, knocking it a solid 10 feet away. Darren narrowly avoided being swept up, putting yet more distance between himself and the golem. Golem confronted the last foe. Though the attacks were every bit as ferocious as before, it seemed different, somehow, as though Gilliman had figured something out. His dodges were closer but more certain, and he avoided even the rubble dislodged by the Gillem's wild attacks. The next minute was a masterful dance. Gilliman continued to avoid the Gillem's flurry, not an inch away from the spearhead with every attack. Whenever the Gillem paused, Annalise, Argrave, and Renal attacked it. The Gillem pressed forward, ostensibly on the offensive, yet it felt like they were beating it into submission. When it raised its spear far above its head, preparing for an earth-shattering overhand blow, Gilliman stopped moving. As soon as it began to swing, he swung. Argrave feared the elven vampire had lost his marbles, but the enchanted blade projected out its blade of wind. When the two attacks met, the spearhead broke off, retaining most of its momentum. It stabbed the jade spiral just behind Gilliman. The titanic Gillem fell to its knees, black storm cloud pouring out of its mouth. The cloud rose into the sky steadily, like smoke from a failing engine. Then, both of the immobile Gillems writhed. Lightning shot up into the sky from their mouths. All four of them watched the sky warily. A second later, lightning descended again. Two bolts of lightning struck each knife in turn. Argrave stood, breathing in the silence. A loud clattering drew his attention. Darren had fallen to his back, and his glaive lay beside him. Argrave worriedly approached, pushing past the pain in his chest. He kneeled beside the man. "What's wrong?" Argrave insisted. "Are you hit somewhere?" "Where?" Darren started wheezing. Argrave hesitated for a moment, scanning the man for injuries. Considering he was wheezing, perhaps he'd been struck in the chest. It took him a second to realize that his wheezing was laughter. "What's wrong?" Darren repeated, then resumed his wheezing laughter. "What in the God's name do you think is wrong?" "Almost pissed myself, not ashamed to admit it." Argrave laughed in relief, then looked around. Annalise stood above one of the fallen spearheads. "It is over," she sighed, getting her breathing back under control. She covered her mouth with shaky hands and breathed slowly. Argrave rose to his feet and went to stand next to her, comforting as best he knew how. "Are they safe to pick up?" Gilliman questioned. Argrave turned his head where the vampire was kneeling over the spearhead that had fallen near him. Argrave knelt to the one by Annalise's feet and picked it up. "Wouldn't be much point in coming here if they weren't safe." The dagger was a beautiful thing, completely unworn despite the ferocity of the fight they'd just endured. It had no guard, but its handle was black. Its blade was a resplendent blue metal of some kind and bore barbs near the tip. It had 3 gems in the center of the blade, a large emerald at its base, a smaller one further up, and the smallest just above that. A circle of small rubies encircled each gem. Magic shone in the gemstones. Chapter 165, Lion's Lap. Annalise and Argrave stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms stretched out ahead. His arms were just a bit longer than hers. Spell matrices swirled to life in their hands, and then, they proceeded to blast Gilliman with a C-rank, Sky Sunder, again and again and again. The corridor they were in filled up with sound and white light both as they rained lightning upon the elven vampire. Darren stood at their backs, shielding his eyes. The sound echoed out of the small tunnel dug into mountainside supporting the Skyburnt fortress, and into the skies beyond that. Argrave lowered his hands first, magic entirely spent. A few seconds after, Annalise ceased as well. Ahead, Gilliman stood, both of the daggers of Aias in hand. White sparks danced around both blades, their power so intense they illuminated the entire corridor. The elven vampire took a deep breath and exhaled. The inside of his mouth was glowing the same shade of white emanating from the daggers. He turned on his heels, then stepped away further down the corridor. The light provided by the dancing electricity lit up a great wall before them, with 2 gemstone-encircled slots along the center, rather like a plug. Gilliman thrust both daggers into the wall's slots, one after the other. A great click echoed out through the corridor once the second was inserted. The lightning writhed in the slots wildly, but then, as if finally accepted, it began to dance up the walls. The white electricity morphed into different shades as it traveled along. The sparks filled up the wall in a fashion resembling a meter slowly filling up to completion. Argrave thought it was similar to those strongman competitions where one would slam a hammer upon a button and watch and see how far the light rose up. Everyone watched in awe, and Gilliman released the daggers and stepped back. An image of dancing sparks took form. It depicted an eclipse. A man stood beneath it, thrusting a sword straight through the sun and the moon. Wondrous thing, Annalise said quietly. Now, imagine we charge up his daggers like that, and then he stabs some big monster. Absolutely devastating. Could kill a dragon. That's why I call them the Giantkillers. Argrave pointed his fingers, the least impressed of the group by the light on the wall. Annalise and Gilliman didn't seem to appreciate this commentary, but Duran looked intrigued as he raised his eyebrows at Argrave. As they watched, the wall started to depress. Some mechanism came to life, and it clicked horrendously. The grinding it made was like a screech that triggered some primal discomfort, and everyone tried to cover their ears despite the fact two of them wore helmets and could not necessarily cover their ears. Annalise's star sparrow chirped to express its displeasure. The image faded, and the wall moved about. It shifted from place to place in simple, elaborate blocks, moved by hinges and pistons of some sort. When things were done, the sleek stone corridor extended forward into darkness. Argrave was the first to step forward. He pulled out the relocated daggers, and then handed them back to Gilliman a bit irritated. Don't lose these. Took a mighty wallop in the chest for these. Let's not forget that. And I lost my axe over a mountainside saving your life, Gilliman rebutted, taking the daggers. I'll get you another, he reassured weakly. Gilliman walked away. Hiding a grimace, Argrave looked to Duran. Have your doubts been quelled? Mostly. Duran focused his gaze on Argrave. I never really doubted you. I was just trying to annoy you. You've already disclosed some spooky details that makes my skin crawl, and that was more than enough for me to realize your knowledge is real way back then. Argrave was a bit stunned, but after a while he smiled and gave a resigned shake of his head, turning to the passage before them. This is the passage of the last conquest. Argrave took a few steps deeper into the dark corridor. Their leader, Ayaz, whose daggers we now wield. He had intended to conquer the Lionsome Castle. He died prematurely. Lacking a leader, the subterranean mountain tribes sealed this secret tunnel and made those daggers the key, so that one day his equal could once again lead the tribes to conquer the vast lands of Vaska. Argrave conjured spell light, his magic having already replenished enough from blasting Gilliman to do so. Or so goes the legends. Annalise looked at the daggers in a new light now that Argrave had given their law. It's a very long walk, so we had best get to it. Argrave adjusted his backpack. Once we get into the castle, we just focus on getting out quickly. I know a good route. You know, even in the mountains completely opposite the Lionsome Castle, people talk about House Parban, Duran mused, his glaive meeting the stone and clicking out through the stone corridor with every other step he took. The patriarch of the house is always a fierce, undefeated warrior, but he's honorable. It's been like that for centuries, unchanging. One of them spared the leader of a great confederation. In return, they gave him a wyvern. Yeah, Argrave nodded. Heard that one before. It's true. He does have a wyvern. Considering this tunnel leads right into where it's kept, it stands to reason you'll see it. Duran turned his head, intrigued. Passed right by it, eh? Does the leader man have something interesting planned? Argrave smiled. This was why he liked Duran. The man was crazy enough to consider something like that. In Heroes of Berenda, he definitely would have stolen the wyvern. It was a nice capstone for this route, especially if the player intended to side with Vaska. But now, troubling things called morals existed. No, Argrave shook his head. Even though it might not be the best, my relationship with House Parban has improved somewhat. I don't want a reputation as a wyvern thief, and everyone will see us fly away. I don't care to attract that kind of attention. Not stealing, it's borrowing. After the flight, I'm positive it'll return to its home. Wyverns always do. Well, that's fine. Duran shook his head. I'm much more interested in the current patriarch of House Parban. Ideally, we won't see him, even from a distance. In, out, quick and easy. Argrave used his hands to emphasize the speed. Duran stared at Argrave. Time was, I thought I was on the taller side, but you people. The prospect sneaking with you divests me of all confidence, especially with one of you wearing plate armor. He pointed to Gilliman walking ahead. You'll come to learn Gilliman is one of the most reliable people you could ever wish for. Argrave shifted his pack. Annalise nodded quietly in agreement, and Duran shrugged, saying nothing more. They continued their long walk down the corridor. As they neared the end of the hallway, what was a sleek and square place narrowed into a tight tunnel that forced the three tall people of the group to crouch low, which elicited some laughter from Duran before even he, too, was forced to duck low and proceed. The stone turned into the rough place of dirt, hardened by moisture. The only solace was the lack of insects. They pressed onwards in silence, remaining sure of step despite the signs of the tunnel ending. When they finally came to a solid wall of dirt, Duran noted, I thought you knew everything, Leader man never said that. Argrave felt along the wall. He ran his fingers against it, brushing aside moist dirt as he searched for something. He bit his lips when his fingers brushed against nothing but dirt. Frustrated, he started to dig. He was growing a bit worried they'd need to excavate personally when his fingers met a bit of string. His face brightened at once. He pulled the string out as far as he could and wrapped it around his hands. He leaned back, using all of his body weight and some leg strength to pull on the thing. He hissed as it dug into his hands, pressing onwards. Glimmer noticed Argrave's struggle. He reached down and grabbed the string, giving it a pull. Argrave felt like a child who'd been struggling to do something, only to have his parent do it effortlessly, completely invalidating his efforts. Glimmer continued to pull the string. It was wound into the walls, and once it was pulled free, things fell away effortlessly. The dirt blocking the path ahead crumbled, revealing a set of slots in the wall near identical to the ones they'd first passed through back at the wall. I was pulling it just fine. Argrave muttered. Do you need to charge these once again? Glimmer questioned, retrieving the daggers from his backpack and holding them up. No, just put them in, Argrave said bitterly, still wishing he'd been able to pull the string. Annalise gave him some shoulder pats to comfort him, but Argrave only felt more childlike after that. Glimmer shoved the daggers into the slots. At once, the still walls around them began to shift. A pair of arms pushed forward around them, causing Duran to freak out a little. The arms pushed through the dirt, frighteningly quiet, and jammed it aside very easily, compacting it enough to clear a great deal of room. Eventually the twin arms met something more solid. The fingers of the arm pressed forth, though, cutting into the stone easily. Once they dug in deep enough, they rotated, cutting out a square swath of it. Without any warning, the arms ceased. Argrave stepped forward and pushed on the square bit of stone. It fell forward, cracking loudly as it hit the floor, and sunlight fell upon their party. Argrave squinted, waiting for his eyes to adjust as he moved beyond. When his vision finally settled, he took note of his surroundings. They were on a great plateau of grey stone. This plateau was surrounded by a wall of the same stone no more than 10 feet tall, giving one the impression of an arena. Much of the surfaces was marred with claw marks, and animal bones lay about everywhere, the majority of them broken or partially eaten. And in the center of this plateau, there was a great mound of red scales, curled into a ball. Gods above. Duran stepped out. What a beautiful creature that is. Glimmer stepped up to Argrave and grabbed his shoulder. Argrave looked up at him. The elven vampire watched ahead, wrapped up in caution. Argrave assumed it was because of the wyvern. The great creature uncurled, perhaps disturbed by the sound of the wall falling. Argrave was not especially worried. It was a calm creature, he knew, and if all else failed, druidic magic could at least ensure their safe passage. Just then, he spotted another figure walk out from behind the wyvern, moving to grab its horns. It was a tall man with long, crimson hair, wearing resplendent white plate mail and decorated with a long red cloak. Margrave Reinhardt stared at them, one hand on his wyvern's horns, the other on the sword at his belt. Everyone stood, a bit flabbergasted. It felt like a tumbleweed might fly by at any moment. Chapter 166, Tension Before a Plunge. Argrave stared at the Margrave beside his wyvern. Reinhardt did not advance or retreat, merely stared at them with an indiscernible expression, one hand on the pommel of the sword at his belt, and the other on the horn of his wyvern. Couldn't have spotted him, Glimmer? Argrave whispered to his companion. There was a wall, Glimmer noted. And you gave no time to scout. Not even with that bird. Argrave ground his hands together. I know. I just want to complain. That's the patriarch of House Parbon? Duran asked, some excitement on his tone. He is remaining by his wyvern in case he needs to retreat, I suspect, Annalise noted, ignoring Duran's query. All right, Argrave finally turned. Nobody do a damn thing. Just stay still. After giving that command, Argrave let out some curses. All right. God damn it all. Argrave took a step ahead, and breathed deeply, trying his best to appear confident. The three of you will wait here. I'll go alone, resolve things. I'm sure he won't be spooked by that. That is dangerous, Annalise protested. I'll be fine. I got away from him once before unscathed, and I can do it again if need be. Argrave walked away. Argrave. Annalise called out once again, and he heard her step forward. Argrave turned and held both his hands out, palms facing her. I'll be fine. She stared, and then nodded. Be careful, she cautioned, not entirely satisfied by his assurance. With a wink, he turned back to the Margrave and his wyvern. Though he walked confidently and kept his expression firm, his grimacings writhed within his clothing, mirroring his own anxiety. He kept his hands in plain sight, and far away from any pockets within his grey leather duster. Though the Margrave did not lower his hand from the sword at his belt, he did not flee or brace himself. Argrave came to stand across from Margrave Reinhardt. He kept a fairly large distance between them, but he was close enough to hear the wyvern's breathing. The Margrave glared up at him with his ruby eyes, expression inscrutable. Hi, Argrave repeated his earlier greeting. Argrave, Reinhardt finally said. Barely recognized you. Argrave brushed one hand through his hair. Certainly, he was tanner, his hair was longer, and his eyes were much different. Hopefully the change is positive. What is this? the Margrave questioned with a growl. An ambush, a secret meeting, intimidation. Nothing like that. Argrave quickly shook his head, and then rubbed his cheek with one hand. If you want me to be honest, we thought you wouldn't be here. Reinhardt clenched his wyvern's horns tighter, showing possessiveness. You thought to take from me once again. Did you? Forget that. If I wanted a wyvern so desperately, my friend back there could provide. Argrave pointed back. He's from one of the southern tribes, son of a chieftain, actually. And yes, you're not mishearing things, Argrave continued, falling into his practiced suave rhythm. He's from the southern tribes. Meaning, I've been in the burnt desert these past. Well, it's been a while. 2 months, maybe more. The Margrave frowned, but Argrave pressed on. There was something I very desperately needed in the burnt desert. You can see it right now. Don't touch, though, Argrave cautioned, pointing to his eyes. It wasn't the full truth, but it was the easiest example to use in this conversation. I came to get these eyes, among other things. It's a very long story, and I won't bore you with it. But, Argrave raised a finger. I had to get back to Vaska, and passing through that big gate beneath the Lightsome Wall, something tells me that would never, ever happen. So, I just wanted to sneak through here. I am sorry about the wall, though. Argrave clasped his hands together and looked back. A tragic necessity. I can pay you back, he added positively. The Margrave didn't seem swayed by Argrave's assurances. He digested Argrave's words in silence, ruby eyes retaining their cold glare. Eventually, his head shifted in revelation, and he questioned, how did you get to the burnt desert in the first place? I passed beneath the earth. I traveled the low way of the rose, Argrave answered quickly, anticipating the question. He let his answer hang in the air, even though he already knew what he was going to say next. The Margrave furrowed his brows, glancing Argrave up and down. The second he opened his mouth to say more, Argrave cut in. If you'd like, you can confirm with the Stone Apatal Sentinels that I traveled through there a little while ago. While we didn't part on the best of terms, I'm certain you can at least confirm I passed through the Margrave scanned Argrave's face, perhaps trying to discern if he was honest. Would take 2 days at best to send someone to and from the entrance to the low way of the rose, Argrave continued. While I wouldn't care for it, if it can abate your worries about me, I can stay here and gather information. Argrave left those words unspoken. As far as he knew, Stain was here, and he was certain the man would be abreast of most happenings throughout Vaska. He could learn news of the plague, of Princess Ilnor, and of any other unusual happenings that might affect the way in which things played out. Argrave had learned from repeated personal experience that things would probably be far removed from what he knew usually happened. He needed to find out how much things had deviated and adjust his plans accordingly, per Annalise's advice. And she was right. Slowing down to do things deliberately would always be better, even if it wasn't optimal. Though he'd planned to gather information adjust, Parban could fill that role splendidly. Even if you were at the low way, that doesn't mean what you've explained here is true, Reinhardt refuted. Argrave held his hands out. I helped Elias, didn't I? I secured that betrayal with Just, helped your whole house. Is that worth nothing? And my daughter? Did you help her, too? The Margrave said, dead-eyed stare returning. Argrave's face fell. That wasn't the sort of thing he had a response ready for. A father who loved his children would never forget that someone had crippled her. I am sorry, you know, Argrave said quietly, keeping his gaze locked with Reinhardt's. He heard the Margrave's gauntlets creak as he clenched the pommel of the sword on his belt tighter. You always maintained it was an accident. Argrave felt a strange sense of déjà vu as he answered, that doesn't change the fact that it was my fault. I cannot change what I've done. All I have is my words. So, I reiterate, I apologize. He lowered his head in a bow, but kept his eyes locked with Reinhardt's. And if your daughter is willing to accept it, I would extend my apology to her, personally. But if she cannot bear the sight of me, I will respect that. Margrave Reinhardt held Argrave's gaze, pupils trembling. His grip tightened on his sword's pommel further, and then relaxed. He raised a hand to his forehead and caressed it. I come here to dispel my headache, think clearer. Yet even here, you. He took his hand off his forehead and clenched it into a fist. You have done right by my house, and I wronged you in the past by unjustly seizing you. Your companions, they will be staying with you? Argrave brightened. Yes, they will, he confirmed happily. I will not make the same mistakes as last time, however. You, and all of yours, will be heavily guarded and watched. Reinhardt's gaze wandered to his companions. And that tunnel? How? Argrave nodded without protest. Thank you for giving me a chance, Margrave Reinhardt. I'm eager to talk to Stain and Elias once more. The Margrave studied his face when he mentioned Stain and Elias. Argrave was perplexed for a moment before the Margrave said bitterly, my son isn't here. Nor is Valadrian. Or as you called him, Stain. But I've been in contact with him through Helmut. Things. The Margrave trailed off. Argrave raised a brow curiously. Though Argrave had only spoken to the Margrave for 15 minutes or so before he and his companions were taken away to where they would be residing, what he learned was harrowing. The plague, which Argrave had been certain would remain in the northwest, was ravaging the south at an alarming rate. Elias and Stain were locked in a siege caused by a revolt at El Brail, where the plague ran especially rampant. The Margrave seemed to have more information to divulge, but they were led to their rooms to rest before more could be asked. Things keep getting further and further out of place, Anneliese, he whispered, sitting beside Anneliese as she rested in bed. He hunched over his knees, staring at the floor. We thought they might, she pointed out as she stared up at the ceiling. A lot of my confidence. Argrave lifted up his head and looked at her. Comes from knowing what's going to happen. Anneliese poked his ribs, and he flinched in surprise. Does it? I am skeptical. Well, it's... Argrave paused. Forget about that. Are you alright? I am fine. She shook her head at once. Come on, he insisted. There has to be something bothering you. Why must something bother me? She questioned. Doesn't feel right, constantly talking about my doubts, my problems. Argrave shook his head. I want to help you. I don't want to lean on you for every nuisance that surfaces in my head. I am older than you, she pointed out. I have had more time to settle myself. Only a few years. Not sure any amount of age can prepare you to handle what we've been doing, Argrave said skeptically, then laid down beside Anneliese. She moved over to accommodate him. I just want to be someone you can rely on, that's all. I do rely on you. More than you realize, evidently, she rebutted. How? Argrave stared at the ceiling. I have always been looking for something to herald, a cause, an ideal. Something to be a part of, something to belong in. I never belonged anywhere. She held her hand up in the air. I thought Aiden was becoming that, ever so slowly. It was a nation, even an empire, to build, surrounded by people I respected who might respect me in turn. I just needed to prove myself. Do you miss it? Argrave questioned, though he was afraid of the answer. I was getting to that. She lowered her hand. Maybe I could have built a life there. From what you say of the me in your world, it seems I did, once. I cannot speak to my happiness there, of course, nor even of its veracity. She moved closer and placed her hand on his chest, and he turned to look at her. But I have found something to herald. Your cause, fighting against Girektik, and I feel like I am where I belong, now. Argrave stayed silent, putting his hand atop her own. After a time, he said, let's see if you sing that same tune when we're 50 feet underground in a cavern of bugs again. She laughed, disturbing the quiet of their stone room in the Lion's Son castle. Argrave turned back towards the ceiling, finally feeling a bit tired. Now that I know what I do, I feel like I need to rush out, head to the northwest, join up with Ryan, and tackle this damned plague immediately. Girektik must be cackling at what I have done. Patience, she urged. Rushing things will do much more harm than good. You will fail if you rush. Yeah, he agreed. And as much as I wish to help Elias, it's difficult to accept that I just have to leave him, trapped in a siege. Margrave Reinhardt said he offered to rescue his son, but Elias refused, Anneliese pointed out soundly. Elias himself does not wish to be removed from the situation. Not sure if I'll accept that explanation if he dies because of Vasca's scheme. Argrave looked to Anneliese. Unlike all his other worries, she offered no answer. Chapter 167, Captive Audience. You are fine with meeting him? Questioned Reinhardt, who ate a plain, unseasoned cut of beef with only water as a side. I am. In truth, I have a poor memory of the happenings that day, Rose said truthfully, whose decadent breakfast meal stood in stark contrast to the Margrave's ascetic portion. She shared the Margrave's prominent features, red hair and red eyes. Her legs were hidden underneath the table, but her chair had 2 wooden wheels on the side. What rumors spread say he is much different than when I knew him. But then, it has been near 8 years. The Margrave leaned closer. Are you certain? Do not push yourself for my sake. She gave a nod of confirmation, then picked at her food. Beside her, a grey-haired young woman with bright orange eyes ate in quiet. The 3 present were all part of or soon to be part of the Parban family. A small staff of servants tended to them, while knights stood on guard at the doors. As most of the rest of the Lion's Son castle, the place was made of carved stone. The Margrave looked down to a letter just beside him on the table. It had a wax seal on it depicting a swordfish, split from being opened. Reinhardt scanned the closing once more. Though I support your cause, you are brash. If you end this war with no plans for what comes after, the entire realm will be shattered by would-be kings pressing whatever vague claim they might have. Winter has stalled the war. Take this time to find a proper claimant. Having an undisputed, supported claimant against King Felipe will keep the realm whole and may even attract undecided supporters to our cause. I will make no suggestions through letter, barring that my daughter has refused. I will write, however, that some rumors of grandiose feats from Mateth are truer than you might think, and those you despise may simply be misunderstood. When things have settled at Mateth, I intend on visiting. I hope we can discuss this in further detail when I do. Until then, be well. Duke Enrico of Montesai. The Margrave lifted his head and let out a long sigh, staring at his daughter. His face was wrought by complexity, but he slowly fell into a smile as he watched his daughter eat. If you would, continue to speak to him and judge his character while he is here. Test him thoroughly, provided he does not make you. The Margrave trailed off, judging his daughter's reaction to the idea. I'm fine, father, Rose insisted. That's good. The Margrave nodded, then took a drink of water. I plan on having him stay for some time. Argrave and Annalise stepped idly around the gargantuan wall blocking the Soul Valley between the burnt desert and the lands of Vaska. 2 guards walked behind them, watching, and all the knights stationed obviously had been given command to keep an eye on them. His Brimmerseners walked a bit sluggishly behind the 2 of them. They looked like they had overeaten. Evidently there were many good souls to eat in the Lionson Castle. The winds were harsh so high up, and likely doubled in force by the funneling of the valley. Argrave and Annalise wore their thicker grey dusters, both still dirty from traversing the mountain highway. A long time ago, Argrave would have found such a thing intolerable. But he was used to the roads by this point. I never imagined such wonders existed in the world, be it in the burnt desert, or here in Vaska. Humans make grand things, she concluded, gazing at the gargantuan taupe lion statue with an enchanted jewel gleaming like a sun in its jaw. Her star sparrow perched on the wrist, eating magic seeds from her hand. Argrave paused with her. That jewel replenishes all of the enchantments on the wall. It looks like a sun. And it harvests the sun's energy, too. It wasn't made by Vaska, though, nor House Parban. You know much, Reinhardt cut in, and Argrave turned his head. He hadn't heard the man's approach past the fast winds atop the gargantuan wall, and he scolded himself mentally. Even if the Margrave had granted him accommodation, it did not make them allies. He should have gotten Gilliman. Margrave Reinhardt. Argrave paid his respects with a slight bow, and Annalise mimicked him a second later. The Margrave wore his white plate armor even this early in the morning. He came to stand before the 2 of them. He was just shy of Annalise's height. My men tell me that one of the rooms went unused, he noted, ruby-eyed gaze alternating between the 2 of them. Argrave raised a brow, saying nothing in response. Rumor has it you are betrothed to Nicolette of Montesai, he continued, his disapproval evident in his words if not his tone. Argrave shook his head at once. That was never officiated, and it never will be. Now, the Margrave shifted on his feet, perhaps not expecting such a response. You throw away much. The Solar of House Montesai. I throw away nothing at all, Argrave disagreed. Nothing could compare to what I've already got. I'll never compromise on her, no matter what's offered. Argrave said his words boldly, causing Annalise looked down bashfully. The Margrave stepped away, gazing out over the walls and into the city of Parban at the foot of the mountains. War has a way of whittling away that steadfastness. I pray that does not become the case with you. The Margrave shook his head. There are a few things you should know. Most of the lords of the south have locked down the roads, barring any travel, even trade, to prevent this plague from spreading. What? Argrave frowned. Well, we can stay off the roads, then. Maybe. But patrols abound, and you have much cargo to haul. The Margrave looked up into Argrave's eyes. And I don't think you should travel, either. I have things to do, Argrave disagreed. Too important to not take my chances, at that. And moreover, with things as terrible as they are, your top priority should be reaching out to Just. Argrave insisted, stepping closer. That's the closest thing to a center of magic in the world, other than the Tower of the Grey Owl, maybe. If you want to find ways to abate, to combat this plague. Reinhardt raised a hand up to interrupt Argrave. I am still considering measures. Ordering roadblocks was one of them. For future actions. Roadblocks, BFFT. Argrave shook his head. Why? Do you think refugees spread the disease, when there's been not a single village that's been raised? This is something already in the cities, Margrave. Reach out to Just. This disease must take your top priority, he insisted. The Margrave inhaled and sighed. I must. More will be lost by indecision than wrong decision. This disease is virulent and highly contagious. Annalise supported him. There's no proof of that. One of the Margrave's knights disagreed. The Margrave looked torn, but he eventually shook his head. My daughter has consented to accepting a personal apology. He changed the subject. It was Argrave's turn to feel uncomfortable. He did have a reason to speak with his daughter beyond merely apologizing. Talking with her might be important for dealing with Orion. All that said, he was to apologize for something that he had never done to a person who was badly affected. It weighed at him a little, but not enough to call it off. Moreover, Elias mentioned you told him of a way to heal Rose, Reinhardt noted. Argrave frowned. He remembered that. Should he not have? Reinhardt questioned coldly. Far from it. I meant what I said. I just figured he would never trust a word out of my mouth. Argrave held his hand out. Her legs can be fixed. The Margrave mused, stepping away. We will talk again later. Dinner, perhaps. For now, one of my... He paused. 5 of my men will lead you to Rose, he corrected. I will expect you to go alone. These knights of mine will be mages. Don't know why that's relevant. Argrave acted oblivious. You should. Between that tunnel, gods know how you found it, and my horse, you owe me much. The Margrave shook his head, and then walked away. Argrave stood there agape. Annalise looked at him with one brow raised. He had never told her the story of stealing the Margrave's horse. Soon enough, as promised, 5 men came to Argrave, ready to escort him to Rose of Parban. Stain opened 2 double doors stretching up to the ceiling, putting his back into the effort. He fixed his tousled brown hair and looked back, where Elias waited. Together, the 2 of them entered into a banquet hall. Though the place was decadent, its decorations were sparse now, and the only bit of furniture in the room was a single gargantuan rectangular table made to accommodate 100 people. Each and every chair was filled. Presently, a fat man sat at the head of the double, wearing an oversized doublet without sleeves. His shirt's bright red color made him resemble a tomato. Though still overweight, loose skin on his arms indicated he had once been very fat. He was bald and had genial green eyes. A tall and skinny woman sat beside him. She had a shrewish, stern look to her with great strength in her dark eyes, and she wore her brown hair bound by jewels in a bonnet atop her head. The man was Duke Moroch of Elbril. His wife, Duchess Christine of Kil, was the one beside him. All of the other chairs were occupied by servants of the castle, maids, male attendants, knights, noble councilmen. There was a great disparity in status between many, but all ate the same thing, a quarter loaf of bread, 2 slices of meat, and a simple stew of vegetables. The Duke and his Duchess were no exception. As Elias glanced around, the Duke spotted him. The man had a bright, childlike glee to him as he smiled, half rising to stand. "Young Master Elias," he called out. His wife slapped his chest lightly, forcing him to sit down. Elias strode over with Stain just beside him. "Duke Moroch," he greeted with a polite slight bow. "Have a seat." He pointed to the place of honor beside him. "I reserved it for you." "Thank you." He took the seat, and Stain was seated someplace not far. There was already a plate of food waiting for both of them, untouched. The Duke paused, glancing between Elias' plate and him. "If you'd like, I can get you more food. You are a large man. Muscled, and it'd be best if—" His wife swatted his fingers. "Don't think of it, Moroch. No exceptions, not even for the lion." His jowls trembled as his head quickly swiveled from his wife to Elias. Forgive me, but I am fine, thank you," Elias interrupted before the Duke could retract his statement. "I should be subject to the ration as much as anyone else." "The young lord is so magnanimous," Duke Moroch blubbered. "Would that more take after you, the world would be a better place." Elias had learned much about the Dukedom of Elbril in his time here. Even if it was not the purpose of coming here, he had no doubts that they would be steadfast allies in the battle to come. The Duke was a kind-hearted person, if a bit slow. These 2 traits allowed his sharp-tongued wife to roll right over him. Though he had met worse people, she was selfish, and desperately grasped for power. "Honestly," Elias began, picking up the piece of bread. He dipped it in the vegetable soup. "I am impressed by the Duke's adherence to this ration. It has increased my opinion of you greatly." The Duke smiled brightly, his thin lips hidden by fat cheeks turning into a crescent moon. "Well, he should strut about, stomach bursting from his doublet, while people outside die to plague, would only make things worse than he's already made them," Duchess Christine commented, tearing a piece of bread apart with her wiry fingers. Stain tapped his fork against his plate, smiling. Elias knew that look. He was angry. He hated the Duchess. Stain had informed Elias that the Duchess had been the source of most of the corruption in the city that generated initial outrage. In addition, she may have been behind the public executions performed by Elbril's knights that caused this siege to happen. Though the besiegers were not genuinely a threat, the Duke did not wish to order his knights to suppress things forcibly. Hostile actions at this point would only exacerbate things. Regarding the plague, Elias diverted the subject. "I have been having my father's court mage, Helmut, examine it." Though Elias had been talking to the Duke and Duchess alone, several people quieted to listen to Elias' next words. He grew nervous and took a deep breath to continue. "The disease appears as distorted, waxy skin that feels as hard as stone to the touch. It spreads from there. Anything it spreads to loses all sensation. Touch, pain, both are gone. It appears most commonly on the hands." Elias looked around, ensuring everyone processed what he'd said. "For some people, it spreads very slow, and indeed can stop after a certain point. For the unluckier people." He shook his head. "When it reaches an organ and affects that organ, it causes failure. Lungs, hearts, stomach, and the brain." "Well, the brain is an exception." Elias shook his head. The Duke was the only one who remained able to eat as Elias continued. "For the brain, it's like rabies. Makes people act irrationally, even hostile." Elias crossed his arms and leaned on the table. "That's why it's spreading so quickly. The worst afflicted spread it. And worse yet, the plague doesn't seem to be entirely organic. There is something mystical about it." According to Helmut's sight bar, the Duchess waved her hands. "These people, so foolish. They demand my husband's head for crimes he did not commit, ignoring Vaska, our common enemy, at their doorstep. The snake is laughing as we tear each other apart." Elias stared at the Duchess, red eyes cold. As he came to know the Duchess better, things fell into place in his head. The Duke would probably never support Vaska without her coercion. She was sure that she had been the linchpin behind their association, and now she so deftly played the supporter. Stain shared Elias' sentiment, tapping one foot against the ground quickly. Elias pushed his plate to draw his attention, then gave the lightest shake of his head to abate his companion's rage. Yet as he sat there, he considered something the Duchess had said. "A common enemy," Elias repeated. His gaze grew distant. "People always unite against a common enemy." "So you would think," the Duchess continued, oblivious to Elias' true thoughts. But instead they cry of corruption, unable to accept their own laziness as the source of their misery. Stain looked ready to blow his stack, but Elias rose. "Excuse us. I've remembered I forgot to do something," he said diplomatically, then pushed Stain's chair out, bidding him to follow. "But you didn't finish eating," the Duke said, watching Elias concernedly. "You enjoy it." Elias gestured, then strode away while loosening the collar on his shirt. Behind, he heard his wife inform the Duke that he could not, in fact, enjoy it. Once they exited back into the hallway, Stain said quietly, "Glad I'm not the only one that can't stand that miserable a common enemy." "Stain," Elias interrupted. "It was right in front of me, but I never saw it. Instead, we've been trapped in a siege for weeks." Stain looked at his friend, perplexed. Chapter 168, Looking Backwards. Why was Argrave wasting his time talking with the crippled daughter of Margrave Reinhardt? That was a good, if somewhat cruel, question. But the answer to that question was the same as why he was here in the Lionsong Castle at all: information gathering. The meeting with Ryan, though still some weeks away, was looming over his head like a guillotine. As far as Argrave knew, there were few people directly connected with the original Argrave. Rose of House Parbon had spent her early days as a ward in the royal palace. Rulio, a main character in the original Heroes of Berenda, had a very unfortunate entanglement with Argrave in the past. Beyond those two, only the royal family had any significant connection with Argrave. Provided nothing went astray, he planned on extracting whatever knowledge he could about himself from the chairbound girl. Rose of Parbon was a sweet person, and that would make things considerably easy. Or so he hoped. Perhaps this was an unnecessary venture. Nevertheless, Argrave thought it might be important to learn some things before speaking with Ryan of Vaska, who was soon to take the top of the list of most dangerous people Argrave had spoken to. That list included the alchemist. The 5 guardsmen led Argrave to the peak opposite the one housing the wyvern. True to the Margrave's words, each and every one of them was a mage. Argrave could see the magic within them. He was glad to see them, as it gave him the chance to discern what each rank of mage's magic would look like in his sight. They weren't exactly labeled with convenient letters. Considering the magic within them was less dense than Annalise's, he was sure that they must have been C rank, or perhaps on the lower end of B rank. Though he debated asking them as they walked along in silence, he never had the chance. One of them stepped forward and opened a large stone door, and then 3 entered. The remaining 2 stood behind Argrave, trapping him. He gave a coy smile and entered without a complaint, careful to duck beneath the door lest he slam his forehead. The apartment was much more wondrous than those he'd seen elsewhere. The place had been painted elaborately, hiding all the bits of grey stone. Bookshelves had been made into trees on the walls, and the rest of the mural depicted vast plains with horses roaming them. Opposite the grand mural, there was a large window that allowed one a grand view of all of Vaska. This must have been personally prepared by the Margrave and was a good testament to his love for his daughter. The daughter in question sat in the center of the room, waiting. She was in a simple wooden chair that had smoothly cut wheels and convenient handles. One of her legs was missing from above the knee. The other looked undamaged, but was terribly small, indicating something was wrong with it. She was small, appearing somewhat frail, and she had the hallmark of House Parbon on display: bright red hair, bright red eyes. Argrave stepped forward, and his knightly escorts spread throughout the room. All of them faced him, evidently ready to attack him if he tried anything. "Hello, Lady Rose," he greeted at once, giving a polite bow. "Hello," she returned after a moment's pause, staring up at him. Her eyes didn't give off an impression of weakness at all. Are you truly Argrave? Is it the eyes that cast doubt?" he questioned, placing one hand against his face. "Well, I suppose it has been many years," he trailed off, not knowing the exact number of years. She placed her hands on her lap. "My father tells me you are here to apologize." "That's right," Argrave confirmed, then glanced around. With the presence of the cold knights, he found it a bit difficult to avoid any awkwardness. He supposed this should not be easy for him. Argrave cleared his throat. "I have much to say about the matter, but I feel it would be best to get to the point. I apologize for causing the severe injuries to your legs." He lowered his head deeply and placed his hand to his chest. "I altered your life unforgivably, and so I will not dare hope for forgiveness. Nonetheless, I wish for you to know I harbor deep regret." In the silence that followed, Argrave heard her take a deep breath and exhale. He felt he'd been sufficiently glib, and he hoped she'd buy it. He had a lot to learn from her. "Do you remember the season in which this happened?" Argrave lifted his head. "No," was what his mind was screaming, but he could not say that, considering it was a horseback accident. "Spring," he said with confidence, though it was a total guess. "Winter, actually," she corrected, causing Argrave to tense up. The knights seemed to bristle at this discrepancy. It marked he didn't care enough to remember, or so they would think. Perhaps Rose sensed this, or perhaps Argrave merely got lucky, for she continued, "But spring and winter are so close to each other. Perhaps it is my memory that is off." She charitably waved her hand. Rose's gaze moved between the knights. She pursed her lips, and then waved. "Please, good knights, give us some time alone." "My lady," one of them protested. "Give me my freedom to choose," At the very least, she smiled. It seemed to strike a chord with the knights, and they all left quickly. Once they were gone, Rose looked up at Argrave. You could convince me you were not the same boy I knew all those years ago, during that winter. What has changed since then? Argrave politely questioned, smiling somewhat. Well, to start with, you would not so patiently wait to be invited to sit all those years ago, Rose said. Please. She gestured for an empty chair. Argrave said his thanks, then pulled the chair to sit beside a table near the Margrave's daughter. Do you still hope for a betrayal with me? She began. Had Argrave been drinking, he most certainly would have choked just then. Instead, he kept his gaze on her eyes and said plainly, Number. I have other commitments. She raised a brow, then rolled her chair closer until she sat opposite the table. Nicoletto of Montisci. Annalise of... You wouldn't know it. He shook his head. My traveling companion. The snow elf? She tilted her head. When Argrave nodded, she seemed surprised. Then you really have changed. How so? Argrave furrowed his brows. She looked out the window into the plains of southern Vasca. I recall that you made comments about cutting off elven ears when we took a carriage tour of Daruka. So, Argrave was a racist, he noted mentally. Nothing changes one's opinion of another more than exposure, he dialogued casually. And halting an invasion, this was your exposure? She looked back to him. No, Argrave shook his head with a smile. A mercenary. Guilliman. He taught me more than anyone besides. He stopped himself from saying his father, because Argrave didn't exactly have a good father figure. He taught me about strategy, honor, loyalty, reliability, and ways to cope. He finished vaguely, hoping she'd catch the bait. Cope? She took the bait. You mentioned your memory of the events was off. Argrave gestured towards her. There are big holes in my childhood, and... Well, I shouldn't get into this. He shook his head, acting hesitant. Please, I can listen, she insisted. Argrave bit his lip. I don't want to talk about how hard I had things. It trivializes. His gaze darted to her legs, then off to the side. Trivializes what I did to you. And it isn't trivial. I did something horrible. Rose looked genuinely affected by his words, and Argrave felt guilty that they were all empty. They sat in the silence, neither looking at the other. I heard rumors that Indune enjoys orphaning children, Rose said lightly. Argrave looked at her, trying to act as though she'd struck a sensitive spot. I see, she nodded slowly. Some learned men say that the mind deliberately represses some memories that are traumatic, Argrave said suggestively. Like I said, there are big holes in my memory. He finally looked at her, locking his golden-eyed gaze on hers. People tell me I was a terrible person, and I do remember doing terrible things, but I would like to turn a new leaf. Can I? No, I shouldn't. He turned away. You can talk to me. She rolled her chair a bit forward. Argrave refused to meet her gaze for a few seconds, then turned over. Can you help me recount things? I want to make things right. With you, with everyone. He turned out to the window, eyes distant. I was so far gone that I didn't even realize half the things I was doing were wrong. Rose looked hesitant, but she did eventually nod. All right, I can help you with that. In return, you'll have to answer some of my questions about your travels, she bartered. I don't know how you can agree so easily, Argrave said emotionally. Yeah, anything you want to know. Argrave felt the filthiest he had ever been, but the prospect of meeting Orion kept the facade right over his face. He'd be sure to get what he needed to know. Little Argrave had a stutter? Annalise questioned curiously. As ever, they watched the sun set together, sitting on the edge of the Lionsson Wall, gazing out beyond the mountains. So Rose says. Argrave shook his head. He lost his mother at 8. In Dune's doing. Little Argrave watched, apparently. Unfortunately, Rose never met her. Annalise looked disappointed, but she quickly refocused. Anything useful for dealing with Orion? His relationship with the man? Rose's knowledge had an 8-year gap. She left Daruka when she was 13. I did learn how old I am, though. He looked at Annalise. 20. Young. Annalise raised a brow. Younger than me. Argrave put his thumbs against his chest. Though only by 2, no, it would be 3 years, now. Argrave lowered his hands and clasped them together. Bottom line is, I don't think Orion hates me. And that's all I need. Yet something troubles you, Annalise noticed. I don't know. It was weird. Argrave shook his head. She kept asking all these questions about me. Wouldn't call it friendly, per se, but I knew something was up. Like father, like daughter, like son. All of the Parbans are terrible at hiding things. It made it difficult to learn what I wanted. But I'd say it was sufficient. He turned his head to Annalise. And we were also invited to dinner. Annalise raised a brow. Chapter 169. Stay a while and listen. The family of House Parbanet in a quiet, if harmonious atmosphere. The Margrave ate the same thing he had with every meal, a simple steak, unseasoned, with water. His eyes fell upon the grey-haired woman beside his daughter, still eating quietly. Is everything all right, Rydia? The Margrave questioned. Oh, she lifted her head, as though drawn from a daydream. Oh, yes. Everyone has been very kind to me here. The Margrave nodded. I apologize that my son could not be here. I promise you that Elias will make it up to you as your fiancé. He can hardly be, The doors to the room opened and Rydia flinched, cutting her sentence off. Argrave stood there, wearing the same grey leather armor as he had the past few days. It was clean now, though. His 3 companions stood just behind him. He scanned the room, thought there'd be more than just us. Argrave said hesitantly. Reinhardt gestured to the chairs opposite Rydia and rose. Sit, he commanded. Argrave nodded without protest, then moved to sit. The Margrave took a piece of paper and stowed it away in his pocket, then adjusted some of his cutlery. Argrave hesitated to sit right next to Reinhardt, but eventually he swallowed and did so, sitting quite rigidly and politely. He briefly looked at Rose of Parban. He wasn't particularly worried about her. He was sure he left a good impression, even if he wasn't 100% confident he'd sold her on his ideas. Someone would need to be delusional to guess the truth about Argrave. No one would assume he was a different person entirely, even in a world of magic. Fill 4 plates. The Margrave commanded a serving staff off to the side. 3, Argrave amended. Glimmen prepares his own food. He's very particular. It would be impossible to sustain such a physique otherwise. No. The Margrave frowned, then amended. Bring platters, let them serve themselves. Some are larger. Argrave had no protest to this. He greeted everyone sitting at the table with silent gestures, then finally locked his gaze on the Margrave. So, what did you wish to talk to me about? Argrave smiled. The Margrave fiddled with his cutlery, then planted a fork in his steak. I sent men to the Lowway of the Rose to verify your claims, he began. They've been delayed. Annalise frowned and tapped Argrave's foot with hers. He didn't turn his head, but he acknowledged her signal. This was something they devised in private. Reinhardt was lying, and her tapping her foot against his was their signal. I will accommodate you well as long as you are here, the Margrave continued, ignorant of their exchange. I bear no hostility towards you. Considering the plague and the war, I think it would be best if you stayed. Things are dangerous. The Patriarch of House Parban is scared of disease and war. Never could have pictured that, Darren interjected. Darren, let's save the provocations for people who can't command a legion of knights to swarm into here. Argrave held out his hand to silence the man, then smiled pleasantly. You may know that the burnt desert is a little unsafe, shall we say? One might call it a hellish place. And by one, I mean everyone. A little danger makes life worth living, so I'll be fine to leave as soon as you feel fit. Besides, I have places to be urgently, Argrave added. The Margrave leaned forward and placed both elbows on the table. It is in your best interest to stay in my castle, he said awkwardly. Reinhardt was obviously trying to be subtly suggestive, but he was utterly terrible at it. Argrave frowned and locked eyes with the Margrave. Unlike that staring contest they'd had long ago, the Margrave broke away first. Rest assured, I will not again mistreat you, he added. While I cannot say I will ever forgive what you have done to my daughter, she has. He placed one big, gauntleted hand on her wrist. And that is more than enough for me to set aside any grudge. You are yours will be guests of honor. Argrave was half expecting Annalise to tap his foot again, but he simply watched Reinhardt meet his gaze. He wants me to stay, Argrave realized. What in the world? Why? He's not aggressive, or mad, he's just... I can't make sense of this. I'm having dinner with someone who thinks I crippled his daughter, alongside that very daughter, and they're trying to persuade me to stay. Argrave looked at Annalise for a moment, then turned back to the Margrave. Well, he swallowed. I do have much to ask about the war. Do you think I could ask questions on that front? The Margrave took his hand off his daughter's wrist, then said hesitantly, I try to avoid discussing affairs of state at the family dinners. It's fine, Rose interjected. We rarely have guests, and I am not so fragile that I would collapse from a few where you speak of the war. You agree, Rydia? I have no issue, she said quietly. But it's your mother's. He trailed off with a weak voice, then sighed. Never mind, he continued, voice cold once again. I will answer what questions you have. Just then, the serving staff re-entered, placing grand platters of food on the center. Argrave eyed the meatier parts of the table. All right, Argrave nodded enthusiastically, moving to get his own portion. What are the big happenings of the last 2 months? My brother was slain by Vaska, the Margrave said heavily, placing both his arms on the table. Argrave paused before he touched the food on the table, feeling disrespectful. What? He asked, and when no answer came, continued, that's good for the rebels. He left that part unspoken. With no hostage, they had less power over Reinhardt. You have my condolences, Argrave offered. I didn't know Bruno, but I know he was a man of character. The Margrave grunted gruffly, something Argrave didn't begrudge him. From what I know of your people and its culture, that must have weakened support for Vaska greatly. Annalise pressed. And swelled your own ranks with new supporters. Argrave looked at her curiously. That is true, he said, voice dead and harsh as though he loathed the fact. Annalise nodded, lost in thought. Then, she continued, and this plague, has it struck the north as severely as the south? Margrave Reinhardt shifted, frowning. I cannot say with certainty, but people say it has been contained in the northwest. And where did it begin moving across the south? She pressed further. From one point, or from many at once. With her pointed inquiries, Argrave caught on to what she was implying and stiffened. The Margrave was a bit slower and answered her question no more than what she asked. I am unsure. It simply swept across in an unprecedentedly fast manner. Like it was aided, Argrave suggested quietly, and Annalise lowered her head. Point made. Reinhardt turned to Argrave, expression slowly becoming more and more stern. You suggest. He trailed off, perhaps realizing the pointlessness of his question. He set his hand upon the table, slowly clenching it into a fist. Would Felipe stoop so? The Margrave couldn't even finish his sentence, so intense was his rage. He would, Argrave said with a bitter confidence. That worthless piece of shit definitely would. The Margrave pushed away his plate of food, all appetite lost. His intense anger was slowly brought under control as he breathed steadily. With this happening, all the more reason for you to entreat your ally, just, Argrave said. Magic is the only solution for something like this. Get healers. Hell, ask for the Order of the Grey Owl's help. Their neutrality does not forbid them from offering medical aid, and this is an incredibly dire situation. How do you know the plague is dire? Rose questioned. You've been absent. I've seen it firsthand in the northwest, back when it was in its infancy. I didn't realize it would spread so far. Argrave shook his head, lying easily. The skin turns waxy, distorts into bumps. It causes organ failure, irrational behavior when it spreads to the brain. And even if it stops spreading, the person never recovers from the damage. Additionally, even if they heal, they continue to spread it, indefinitely. People say it is the wrath of Moda, the goddess of plague and rot. Rydia contributed. She is angry at the war. Spread a deadly disease to protest a deadly war, Duran noted cynically. Very godlike. Fits with my experience of the idiocy of the gods. It's not from the gods. Argrave shook his head. It's born from man, with some meddling from Girektik Kiet. With everything being brought to light, it felt all the more urgent that Argrave leave. He wanted to stand up and run out. As he was consumed by the thought, he felt a hand on his own, and looked to Annalise. He smiled lightly at her assurance and clenched her hand. The Margrave watched that exchange, though both of them were oblivious. I must go and talk to some people. The Margrave stood. Your advice is sound, Argrave, and I will propose it to my council. I did nothing at all. Argrave raised one hand humbly. All of you. Eat well. I apologize for my abrupt departure. Seek me out should you need anything. And your companion. He stopped beside Skillerman, who nearly stared Reinhardt in the eyes despite sitting. Should you need it, you may replenish your rations. Ask my staff. I'm sure he will. Argrave smiled, and Gilliman gave him a cold-eyed glance before nodding to the Margrave. The Margrave left, some knights following him. Argrave turned back to his food. Consuming his thoughts was a strong desire to go and sort some of the information he'd been dealt. Only a few things changed, yet it's all spiraling. Chapter 170. Dissonance. In the days that passed, Argrave's strong suspicion that the Margrave intended for him to stay became a certainty. The head of House Parban lacked subtlety and had all but said you will stay here. It definitely did not have the same atmosphere as the first time Argrave had been restrained by Reinhardt. He was not yanked about by a rope untied to posts, and though their party of 4 was guarded strictly, there was never a hostile atmosphere. The Margrave continued to insist that the men he sent to the Low Way of the Rose had not yet returned. Argrave had asked some pointed questions to figure out if the Margrave was hiding anything, as though he had something planned for a few days later. But Annalise insisted that the Margrave bore them no ill will, which was surprise enough. They were watched quite closely. The only place they had a chance to talk without knights shadowing them was in their assigned quarters, and even there, they waited just outside. A ward was sufficient to stop most of their talk from leaking outside. Never would have pictured the fearsome patriarch of House Parban as just a family man. Duran shook his head, his glaive laid out across his lap. That grey-haired woman was quite the pretty one. Don't even try. Argrave shook his head. She has a fiancé, and if you mess that up, I'll flay you. Too shy for my tastes. Don't worry. Duran held his hand out. The Margrave seems an interesting man, but never a chance to talk to him. Such a shame. Argrave shrugged, sitting across from Duran in a circle alongside his other 2 companions. A ward blocked their conversation from any listeners. To be fair, he spends most of his times in meeting with his vassals devising measures for the war. Yeah, he goes to work so his family stays safe, and then once he's home, he spoils them. A family man, like I said. Duran tapped the tip of his wyvern bone glaive. Though I guess that'd give him reason to fight harder against our invasions. More to fight for. Duran looked up at Argrave. Why are we milling about here? Argrave uncrossed his legs, then recrossed them, anxious. This guy keeps coming up with contrivances every damn day to keep us here. He said there was a cave-in at the lower levels of the castle, and he wasn't sure it'd be safe to leave. What the hell is that? A 5-year-old can come up with better lies than that. Glimmer locked eyes with Argrave. Press the issue, he suggested. I may have to, but... Argrave lowered his head. Why is he doing this? The only thing I can guess is that he's waiting for a response from someone. Duke Enrico, maybe. I suspect he wishes to ask you a favor, Annalise suggested, eyes staring off into the distance. He is merely probing whether or not you are trustworthy. That would explain why he and his daughter are asking you so many questions. Indeed, asking all of us questions. Why not just sneak out? Darren questioned. Force our way out. Even difficult. Guilliman shook his head. It was hard enough for me to replenish my rations. He looked at Argrave as he said those words with a bitter sarcasm. Argrave smiled, then supported Guilliman's claim, saying, and I don't want to make the Margrave toss aside what little goodwill I've built up in that icy heart of his. Doing something like that. Sneaking out isn't the problem. Someone's going to get hurt, I'm sure of it, he said, pausing as he recalled the unfortunate circumstance with the stone apatal sentinels. Argrave held his hand out to amend, not us, but them. And the Margrave would care about something like that. His heart might be icy, but that just makes it bigger. He cares for his men. Then what do we do? Darren held his hands out in a shrug. Tonight, we're having dinner with them again. And I'll press the issue, as Guilliman suggested. Argrave rubbed his thumb against his knuckles. Failing that, I definitely don't plan on staying another night. If no answers come, we'll devise a plan the next morning. I spoke with my counselors, Reinhardt said, and received some petitioners from the nobles that have thrown in their lot with me. The unanimous consensus is that this plague is a serious matter. And so I heeded your advice. I contacted Just and the Order of the Grey Owl, requesting aid, he told Argrave. Argrave smiled. My words finally got into that thick head of yours, eh? He paused, thinking he might be acting overly familiar. Forget I said that. That's a good development. The Margrave cleared his throat, then cut into the unseasoned beef he ate every meal. Argrave wasn't sure the man got the proper nutrients. What do you think should be the priority moving forward? Margrave Reinhardt questioned. Argrave glanced around the table, taking in the expressions of everyone. He hadn't intended to talk about this, and he briefly considered changing the subject. But in the end, he might be able to change things for the better when he had the Margrave's ear. The plague, obviously, that has the potential to do the most damage to the people, be they the high and mighty or the weak and decrepit, until it's abated entirely. Or until better methods are found to combat it. It's the most harmful to the world. Argrave finished by pointing to the Margrave. It's not the pragmatic thing to do. You may suffer in the war effort, but that is why Felipe deserves to be dethroned, and why it must be you that does it. Hear, hear. Darren raised his glass of wine. The Margrave shifted, perhaps stirred by Argrave's words. He set his elbows on the table, then questioned, and what about your priority? The same, he replied at once. This plague, the longer it goes unaddressed, the worse things will get for everyone, no matter who they are. That's why I intend to head northwest, where people have had it longer. Examining them may help me glean some insight into curing people, he suggested, only a slight distortion of the truth. And speaking of my priority, Argrave continued, I get the distinct feeling I'm being kept from leaving. The Margrave stopped mid-bite, then lowered his fork. Then, as if trying to appear inconspicuous, he raised the fork up again, and chewed his cut of plain beef all the way through. Argrave waited politely, a bit flabbergasted at how bad this man would be at poker. I don't know what you speak of, the Margrave finally said. Annalise tapped his foot to inform of his deception, but it was unnecessary. Anyone could tell he was lying. Really? Argrave raised his brows in exaggerated surprise. So, that cave-in at the lower levels, no one besides you talked about it? None of us felt it? And hell, it happened despite this castle being so heavily enchanted not even one brick has fallen off. What? His daughter, Rose, looked away, almost embarrassed as Argrave recounted the excuse her father had used. It's a 600-year-old castle. Reinhardt shook his head. Argrave nodded with a plastic grin on his face. And those riders you sent to the Lowway, I didn't realize your men were so bad at simple scouting tasks. No word from them? Reinhardt planted his fork in his steak, then took a long drink of water. No word, he said, setting the cup down loudly. Annalise tapped his foot again. Argrave leaned back into his chair, keeping his eyes on the Margrave almost lazily. He looked to Rose, and then to Rydia of Just, almost as if asking them silently if they believed this nonsense. I think we're going to set off tomorrow, Reinhardt, Argrave said plainly. You can't, he answered at once. Why? Argrave crossed his arms. A snowstorm comes, he said weakly. This far south? Argrave noted, almost mockingly by this point. And with not a cloud in the sky? The Margrave remained firm. You can't, he repeated. Darren stood up, his chair creaking loudly. I can't listen to this anymore, he said. Argrave looked at him with fierce eyes, concerned the man might do something ridiculous. I'm about to burst, Darren continued. Need to use the privy. He left quickly, grabbing his glaive leaning against the wall as he left. He practically sprinted out of the room, one hand held to his stomach. Argrave furrowed his brows, then shrugged. Just then, Annalise tapped his foot, and he came to attention. Darren was lying. Father, Rose began, reaching her hand out. The Margrave looked a bit brighter at that moment, and took her hand. Give it up. You are worthless at this sort of thing. The big warrior looked betrayed for half a second, but he gave a long sigh and took his hand away. All right, I suppose I should be honest. Yeah, Argrave agreed, one eye lingering on Annalise. She gave him a quiet nod, then looked out the door where Dren had left. Star Sparrow, he directed her quietly, and she nodded in agreement, casting the druidic spell beneath the table. In not a second, the bird perched atop her shoulder vanished. It moved so quickly no one noticed it at all. Well, nearly no one. Lydia just had been staring at the bird on Annalise's shoulder, and looked around, confused. The truth is, there is something important you should be let in on, Margrave Reinhardt said slowly. Is that right? Argrave anxiously tapped his finger against a fork, casting glances to Annalise as she focused on watching Dren with her Star Sparrow. He had a bad feeling. I had my reservations, the Margrave admitted, even barring our past association. Your relationship with Annalise, I thought it was whimsy, a flight of fancy from a hot-blooded youth. But there is something more, I believe, and despite the difficulties some might have accepting an elf, she has keen insight and talent in many fields. Argrave nodded, half paying attention. We were blessed to meet, and I count myself among the fortunate to this very day. The Margrave nodded, fortunately looking off to the side. Moreover, my daughter agrees that you have changed significantly. You have not met in 8 years, as I remember. But she tells me that speaking to you now is like speaking to an entirely different person. I will not presume to know your situation. But considering how Felipe's other children turned out, perhaps it is no surprise you were as you were. Yet time away from them, it seems, has changed you. Argrave stared, more focused on whatever Dren was doing outside than what the Margrave was saying. Tomorrow morning, I will wake you up early, Reinhardt continued. The bird re-entered the room, perching itself back atop Annalise's shoulders. She opened her eyes and took a deep breath. I wish for you to meet my close counsel. In part to explain what Just and the Order might help us with, but for other reasons as well. Annalise leaned in and whispered, Wyvern. Argrave had been waiting for that word, and he stood up quickly. The crazy moron is trying to steal the Margrave's Wyvern. Before we go on, Argrave began, an excuse quickly prepared. There is something that I have been meaning to give to you. He spread his arms out grandly. It has slipped my mind the past few days, but if you don't mind, I'd like to get it now. The Margrave leaned back in his chair, then gave a slow, confused nod. All right, come on. Then, Argrave led his companions along. They stood and followed. His grimacers rushed into the room, jumping up onto him and scrambling up into hiding within the confines of his clothes. Once they exited, Argrave kept a brisk pace. Send the bird out. Slam it into that crazy bastard's skull, Argrave directed Annalise. Lead him to a place we can reach him. Guilliman and I will get everyone's stuff. Guilliman stopped. We're going along with this? What? We've got a choice. Argrave pointed out. Cup our hands. Say sorry? That would never work. He's forced our hand. Let's move. All right. Annalise quickly agreed, seeking a safe place to cast her magic. Argrave and Guilliman proceeded. A phrase was repeating in Argrave's head, again and again. Crazy bastard. If you like this audiobook, subscribe the channel for more videos like this. And join my Patreon if you want to support me, where you can find the complete collection Jackal Among Snakes audiobooks. Hurry up, what are you waiting for? Leave some comment and let me know if you guys like this story, or you have a web novel you like and want to hear its audiobook. I will be happy to create them for you. Please like, share, and leave a comment on the video.